One fateful dawn, Eleanor Mill's life changes forever. A simple peasant girl gathering mushrooms in the forbidden forest, she discovers something that makes her heart stop. A man buried alive, gasping for breath beneath the soil. But this is no ordinary man. This is the king himself, victim of the most treacherous conspiracy the kingdom has ever known. As she helps him breathe, their eyes meet. In that moment, a blacksmith's daughter and a monarch form a dangerous bond that will shake the very foundations of power. "Trust no one," he whispers, his voice barely audible. "There are traitors in the castle walls." Now, Eleanor has become the most hunted woman in the realm, with a price on her head that grows by the day. The king's enemies will stop at nothing to silence her, for if the truth she carries reaches the right ears, an entire kingdom built on lies will crumble. But how long can one peasant girl run when every shadow might hide a traitor, and the very person who sits upon the throne wants her dead? The first pale light of dawn crept through the dense forest canopy, casting long shadows across the damp earth. Eleanor, a young peasant woman with calloused hands and bare feet, moved silently through the morning mist. Her tattered wool dress, patched in a dozen places, clung to her thin frame as she searched for mushrooms and herbs, precious commodities that might earn her a few extra coins at the village market. Life had been cruel to her since her father's death last winter. At 17, she was now the sole provider for her ailing mother, and hunger had become their constant companion. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, still wet with dew. Eleanor's keen eyes spotted a cluster of chanterelles near an ancient oak, their golden hue a welcome sight. As she bent to harvest them, something strange caught her attention. A slight movement in the earth nearby, almost imperceptible. She froze, her heart quickening. Again the ground seemed to shift ever so slightly, and this time she heard it, a muffled sound, like a desperate gasp for air coming from beneath the soil itself. "Hello," she whispered, dropping her basket. The sound came again, weaker this time. Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her as she approached the disturbed earth. Someone or something was buried there, and it was still alive. Her hands trembled as she began to dig frantically, tearing at the soil with her bare fingers. The dirt was loose, recently turned, and as she clawed deeper, her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Had bandits buried someone alive? Was it a trap? The forest had always been a place of refuge for her, but now it felt sinister, as though unseen eyes were watching from between the trees. As Eleanor's fingers broke through the final layer of soil, she uncovered a human face. A man's face, caked with dirt, his lips blue, gasping desperately for air. His eyes flew open, wild with panic and pain. She cleared the earth from his nose and mouth, allowing him to take in great shuddering breaths. With growing horror, she continued digging, freeing his shoulders and chest from their earthen prison. The man's clothes, though filthy and torn, were made of the finest materials she had ever seen, rich velvets and intricate embroidery that only nobility could afford. Then she saw it, half buried beside him, a golden ring bearing the royal crest of the kingdom. Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. Her hands froze mid-motion as the terrible truth dawned on her. This was no ordinary nobleman. The man she was unearthing, the man who had been buried alive like a criminal, was King Edmund himself, ruler of the realm, the most powerful man in the kingdom. Her legs weakened beneath her, and she nearly collapsed onto the disturbed earth. "Water," the king rasped, his voice barely audible. "Please." Eleanor fumbled for her water skin, her mind reeling with questions. Who would dare commit such treason? Who had the power, the audacity to bury the king himself? As she helped him drink, she noticed deep wounds on his wrists and neck. He had been bound and beaten before being entombed in the earth. His once handsome face was now a mask of suffering, one eye swollen shut, dried blood caking his temple. "Your Majesty," she whispered, the words feeling strange on her peasant tongue. "Who did this to you?" The king's eyes darted nervously around the forest before meeting hers. He raised a trembling finger to his lips, silencing her question. "Trust no one," he whispered hoarsely. "There are traitors in the castle walls. They believe me dead, and dead I must remain if either of us is to survive the day." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle upon her shoulders. In the span of moments, her simple life had been shattered. She was now the keeper of a secret that could cost her everything: her home, her mother, her very life. The king's enemies would surely kill them both if they discovered what she had found. "Can you stand, Your Majesty?" she asked, helping him to sit upright. The king winced, his face contorted with pain, but nodded. As Eleanor worked to free his legs from the earthen grave, her ears caught a sound that made her blood run cold. The distant but unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats and men's voices. "Someone's coming," she hissed, redoubling her efforts. The king's face drained of what little color remained. They both knew what it meant. The traitors had returned, perhaps to check their handiwork or to move the royal corpse to a more permanent resting place. The king grasped her arm with surprising strength. "If they find me alive, we are both dead," he whispered urgently. "If they find me with you, they will assume you helped me escape their plot. You must hide me and run. Save yourself, girl." But Eleanor knew she couldn't abandon him. Not like this, half-buried and defenseless. The approaching voices grew louder. She made a split-second decision that would change the course of her life forever. With strength born of desperation, she pulled the king to his feet. He staggered, barely able to stand, leaning heavily against her slight frame. "There," she whispered, pointing to a dense thicket of brambles nearby. "We must hide." Together they stumbled toward the hiding place. The king's breathing labored, each step an agony for him. The voices were clearer now, men speaking in low, urgent tones about checking the grave and making sure. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she helped the king into the thicket, thorns tearing at their clothes and skin. They crouched low, the king's body trembling against hers, as the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Through the tangled brambles, Eleanor caught glimpses of 2 royal guards entering the clearing, their crimson uniforms stark against the green forest. These were men sworn to protect the king, yet they approached his empty grave with expressions not of horror, but of satisfaction. The betrayal ran deep indeed. "He's gone," one guard hissed, staring at the disturbed earth. "Someone's dug him up." "Impossible," the other replied, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "No one knew he was here. Search the area. He couldn't have gone far in his condition." The king's hand found Eleanor's in the darkness of their hiding place, his fingers intertwining with hers. In that moment, an unspoken pact was formed between peasant and king, 2 souls bound by a terrible secret and the will to survive. The guards began to methodically search the forest floor, examining tracks, moving ever closer to the thicket. A twig snapped beneath the king's boot as he shifted his weight, trying to ease his pain. The sound, though small, seemed to echo through the silent forest. The guards' heads turned in unison toward their hiding place. Eleanor closed her eyes, a prayer forming on her lips as heavy footsteps approached the thicket. In that moment, she knew there was no going back to the life she had known. From this day forward, she would be either a hero or a traitor, a savior or a corpse. And all because she had chosen to walk through the forest at dawn, all because she had chosen to unearth what was meant to stay buried. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the guards' footsteps crunched through the undergrowth toward their hiding place. Her hand instinctively tightened around the king's, feeling his pulse race beneath his skin. They were trapped like hares before hounds, with nowhere to run. The bramble thicket that concealed them now felt like a cage, its thorns digging into her flesh as a cruel reminder of her predicament. "Check over there," commanded the taller guard, his voice low and menacing. He was no more than 10 paces from where they crouched. Eleanor could see his boots through the tangle of branches, the polished leather spattered with mud. These were men she had once respected, soldiers who had ridden through her village with proud banners, supposedly protecting the realm and its people. Now they were hunting the very monarch they had sworn to defend. The king pressed a trembling finger to his lips, his eyes wide with silent warning. A bead of sweat trickled down his dirt-streaked face despite the morning chill. Eleanor forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had never imagined being this close to royalty, let alone hiding with the king himself while traitors searched for them. The absurdity of it might have made her laugh if terror hadn't frozen her voice. "I don't see anything," replied the second guard, moving past their hiding spot to examine the disturbed grave. But someone's definitely been here. Look at these tracks. Small feet, probably a woman or child. He knelt down, running his fingers over the impressions Eleanor's bare feet had left in the soft earth. Her heart sank. There was no mistaking those tracks as belonging to anyone else. The first guard spat on the ground, his face twisting with frustration. Lord Reynard won't be pleased. The body should have been gone by now, dissolved in quicklime, not dug up by some nosy peasant. His words were spoken quietly, but in the stillness of the forest they carried clearly to Eleanor's ears. She felt the king stiffen beside her at the mention of Lord Reynard, the king's own chancellor and trusted advisor for 20 years. "It doesn't matter," the second guard replied, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "Even if someone found him, what could they do? The proclamation has already been made. The king fell ill and died 3 days ago. The funeral is arranged. Lord Reynard will be named regent by sunset, and Prince Thomas is too young to challenge him." He laughed coldly. Besides, who would believe a peasant over the word of the entire royal court? Eleanor's mind raced, piecing together their words. The treachery was even deeper than she had feared. Not just a few rogue guards, but a carefully orchestrated coup from within the king's inner circle. They had already announced his death to the kingdom, were already moving to seize power, and Prince Thomas, the king's only son, a boy of barely 8 years, was in danger as well. The guards continued to search the area, their conversation turning to more immediate concerns. "The body had to have gone somewhere," the first one muttered. "Dead men don't walk away from their graves." "Unless he wasn't dead," the second guard suggested, his voice dropping even lower. "Lord Reynard wanted to be certain, said to bury him alive, let him suffer before the end. Maybe he had more strength than we thought." "Impossible," scoffed the first. "We beat him within an inch of his life. Broke his ribs, slashed his legs. Even if he somehow survived the burial, he couldn't have gone far." Each casual description of the king's torture made Eleanor's stomach clench with horror. She glanced at the monarch beside her, seeing him through new eyes. Despite his wounds, despite knowing those responsible for his suffering were mere steps away, his face remained composed. Only the slight tremble in his jaw betrayed his rage. The guards began to fan out, methodically searching a wider area. They were thorough, professional in their treachery. Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered the thicket. Her fingers dug into the soft earth beneath her, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. They found only twigs and stones, useless against armed men. Just as the footsteps approached their hiding place once more, a distant horn sounded from the direction of the village. The guards paused, listening. The horn blew again, 3 short blasts, a signal. "That's the call to return," the second guard said. "Lord Reynard must want everyone back for the announcement." "What about the body?" the first asked, hesitating. "We'll have to come back with more men, mark the location. For now we report what we found. Tracks, signs of disturbance, but no king." He sighed heavily. "Better that than being late for the ceremony. You know how Lord Reynard deals with delays." Eleanor hardly dared to breathe as the guards reluctantly withdrew, marking the area with a torn piece of cloth tied to a branch before heading back toward the village. Only when the sound of their footsteps had faded completely did she release the breath she'd been holding, her lungs burning with relief. "They're gone, Your Majesty," she whispered, turning to the king. King Edmund's face had gone ashen, the full weight of the betrayal settling upon him. "Reynard," he murmured, the name like poison on his tongue. "My chancellor, my friend." His eyes, sunken with exhaustion and pain, met Eleanor's. "Tell me your name, girl." "Eleanor, Your Majesty. Eleanor Mills, daughter of the blacksmith from Oakvale Village." "Eleanor Mills," he repeated softly. "You have saved your king's life this day, though it may cost you your own." He attempted to shift his position and winced, clutching at his side. "They spoke truly of my wounds. I cannot move far without help." Eleanor bit her lower lip, considering their options. The guards would return, perhaps with dogs that could track them through the forest. They needed shelter, somewhere to tend the king's wounds and plan their next move. But where could one hide a king? Who could they trust when the royal court itself was corrupt? My cottage is too obvious, she thought aloud. They'll search there first when they find the tracks. We need somewhere else, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. An idea formed in her mind. Risky, perhaps foolish, but possible. There's an abandoned charcoal burner's hut deeper in the forest. Few know of it now. We could reach it before midday if we move carefully. The king nodded grimly. Lead on, Eleanor Mills. It seems my life is in your hands. With great effort, they emerged from the thicket, thorns catching on their clothing. Eleanor supported the king's weight as best she could, his arm draped heavily across her shoulders. Each step was agony for him, each labored breath a reminder of the cruelty he had suffered. They moved slowly through the forest, staying well away from paths, using streams to mask their tracks when possible. They had covered less than half a mile when the sound of footsteps made them freeze once more. Eleanor guided the king behind a large oak, praying that whoever approached hadn't seen them. The footsteps grew louder, a single person, moving quickly, not the heavy tread of guards in boots, but lighter steps. Around the bend in the path came a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, carrying a bundle of sticks. He was thin and ragged, one of the many orphans who eked out an existence on the fringes of village life. The boy stopped abruptly when he spotted them, his eyes widening as he recognized the man leaning against Eleanor. "The king," he gasped, dropping his bundle. "You're alive!" Eleanor's heart sank. They had been discovered, and by a child who couldn't possibly understand the danger of what he knew. Before she could think of what to say, the sound of more footsteps echoed through the trees, heavier this time, purposeful. The guards were returning, and they were no longer alone. The village square bustled with unusual activity as Eleanor was marched through the muddy center, her wrists bound tightly with coarse rope that bit into her skin. 6 royal guards flanked her, their crimson uniforms drawing every eye in Oakvale. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd like wind through summer wheat. Women stopped their washing, men abandoned their tasks at the forge and mill, and children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, pointing at the spectacle of a local girl under armed escort. "Isn't that the Mills girl, the blacksmith's daughter? What's she done to warrant the king's men? Heard she was caught in the forbidden forest, beyond the old boundary stones." Eleanor kept her head high despite her shame, despite the mud splattering her tattered dress and bare feet. Her thoughts were not on the humiliation of this public parade, but on what had transpired in the forest. The king, alive, wounded, hidden, was now her secret to keep. The orphan boy had proven an unexpected ally, quick-witted enough to hide at the sound of approaching guards, leading them away from where the king had concealed himself behind a fallen oak. Eleanor had allowed herself to be captured, drawing attention away from the monarch. Better they take her than continue searching the woods. The village elder, a stooped man with a wispy white beard, approached the guards cautiously. "What crime has this girl committed? She's a good lass, supports her sick mother, never caused any trouble." The lead guard, a hard-faced man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, sneered. "She was trespassing in the royal forest, in a restricted area. That's reason enough to bring her in for questioning." His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the villagers. "Unless anyone else knows what business she had there this morning." Silence fell over the square. Eleanor caught the eye of her neighbor, Mrs. Thatch, who stood holding a basket of laundry, concern etched on her weathered face. The woman took a half-step forward, then faltered as the guard's cold gaze swept over her. No one spoke. No one dared. "As I thought," the guard said with satisfaction. "Take her to the lockup." The village lockup was little more than a stone shed with a heavy oak door and a single barred window, used mostly to house drunks until they sobered up or to temporarily hold thieves caught stealing from market stalls. Eleanor was roughly pushed inside, the door slamming behind her with finality. The interior was damp and smelled of mold, straw scattered across the floor providing the only bedding. A wooden bucket in the corner served as the sole amenity. Eleanor sank down onto the straw, her legs finally giving way now that she was alone. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as the enormity of her situation crashed over her. The king was alive, hidden in the forest, wounded and alone save for an orphan boy. The most powerful man in the realm had been betrayed by his closest advisor, and somehow she, a blacksmith's daughter with calloused hands and not a copper to her name, was now entangled in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the kingdom. Her mother would be frantic by now. Bedridden with lung fever these past 3 months, she depended entirely on Eleanor for everything: food, medicine, care. Who would tend to her now? The thought of her mother lying alone, calling out for her daughter with no answer, brought hot tears to Eleanor's eyes. She brushed them away angrily. Tears would help no one. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Villagers passed by the small window, some stopping to peer in curiously, others hurrying past with averted eyes. None spoke to her. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened across the dirt floor, and the temperature began to drop. Eleanor huddled in the corner, drawing her knees to her chest for warmth. The reality of spending the night in this dismal place settled over her like a shroud. Just as the last light began to fade, the door creaked open. Eleanor looked up, expecting to see the village constable with a meager meal. Instead, a well-dressed man stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the setting sun. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. As he moved into the dim interior, recognition dawned. This was Gerard Voss, a merchant who frequently traveled between Oakvale and the Royal City. His fine wool cloak and silver-buckled shoes spoke of his prosperity. Eleanor had seen him at the village market many times, had even sold him herbs and mushrooms she'd gathered. He had always seemed kind enough, if somewhat aloof. "Eleanor Mills," he said softly, his voice cultured and smooth. "What trouble you've found yourself in?" She remained silent, watching him warily. Something in his manner put her on edge. A certain confidence, a gleam in his eye that spoke of hidden knowledge. Voss leaned against the opposite wall, regarding her with an expression that might have been pity, might have been amusement. "You picked a dangerous day for a walk in the woods, girl. Dangerous indeed." He tilted his head, studying her face. "I wonder what you saw there." The air in the cell seemed to thicken. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Nothing, sir. I was gathering mushrooms, as I often do. The guard said I crossed some boundary I didn't know existed." Voss smiled, a thin, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, we both know that's not the whole truth. You see, I have certain connections at court. I hear things, interesting things." He lowered his voice to just above a whisper. "Things about graves disturbed, about missing kings." Ice flooded Eleanor's veins. How could he know? Who was this merchant really? A spy for Lord Renard? An ally of the king? Or something else entirely? The uncertainty made her throat dry with fear. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she managed to say, her voice remarkably steady despite her inner turmoil. Voss sighed, pushing himself away from the wall to pace the small cell. "Let me be plain, Eleanor Mills. The kingdom stands on the edge of a knife. By this time tomorrow, Lord Reynard will be named regent, ruling in the name of the child prince. Anyone known to be loyal to King Edmund will find themselves removed. Quietly at first, then more openly, as Reynard consolidates power." He stopped directly in front of her, his shadow falling across her face. "The truth of what happened in the forest could kill you, girl. It would be better, far better, to forget what you never saw, to speak of events that never occurred." His voice hardened. "For your own sake, and for your mother's." The mention of her mother sent a jolt of fear through Eleanor's heart. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. This man knew exactly how to press upon her greatest vulnerability. "What do you want from me?" she asked, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "Want? Nothing at all." Voss shrugged elegantly. "I merely offer advice. When you are questioned, and you will be questioned thoroughly, you will say you were gathering herbs and strayed too far into the forest by accident. You saw nothing unusual. You heard nothing strange. You encountered no one." His eyes bored into hers. "That is the truth that will keep you alive." The weight of the decision pressed down on Eleanor like a physical force. To deny what she knew, to abandon the king to his fate, it felt like the greatest betrayal. But to speak the truth meant certain death, not just for herself but possibly for her mother as well. The moral burden was crushing. "The king is dead, Eleanor," Voss continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "The entire court mourns him. The kingdom prepares for his funeral. To suggest otherwise would be, well, some might call it treason, others might call it madness. Neither ends well for a peasant girl." Eleanor looked down at her hands, dirt still embedded beneath her fingernails from digging the king from his earthen prison that morning. Had it only been that morning? It felt like a lifetime ago. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Torchlight flickered through the small window as voices called out urgently. Voss moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. "What fortuitous timing," he murmured, turning back to Eleanor with a cold smile. "It seems search parties are forming. The royal forest will be thoroughly examined tonight, every inch of it." The threat in his words was unmistakable. "Remember what I said, girl. Some truths are best left buried." With that, he rapped on the door. The guard outside unlocked it immediately, suggesting that Voss indeed had considerable influence. As he stepped through the doorway, he paused to look back at her, his silhouette framed in the torchlight. "Choose wisely, Eleanor Mills. Few get second chances in this world." The door slammed shut, leaving her alone once more. Through the small window, Eleanor could see the torches gathering in the village square. Dozens of them, like fireflies in the darkness. Men's voices called out orders, dogs barked, and horses' hooves clattered on the cobblestones. They were going to search the forest. They would find the king. And if they did, all would be lost. The cell grew colder as night descended, darkness so complete that Eleanor could barely see her own hand before her face. Outside, the village had fallen eerily quiet after the search parties departed for the forest. Only the occasional footsteps of the guard patrolling past her door broke the silence. She huddled deeper into the corner, drawing the thin blanket of moldy straw around her shoulders, trying to ignore the gnawing fear in her stomach. Her thoughts kept returning to the king, wounded, vulnerable, hidden somewhere in the vastness of the forest, with only an orphan boy for protection. Had they found him already? Was all hope lost? The distant church bell tolled midnight, its somber notes carrying across the sleeping village. Eleanor had just begun to drift into an uneasy sleep when a soft scraping sound at the door jolted her awake. She froze, listening intently. The sound came again, metal against metal, deliberate but quiet. Someone was unlocking the door. Her heart pounded wildly. Had Voss returned with more threats? Or perhaps the guards had come to take her for proper questioning, away from the prying eyes and ears of villagers who might sympathize with her. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with the faintest creak of rusted hinges. Eleanor pressed herself deeper into the shadows, prepared to fight if necessary. A stooped figure entered, moving with surprising stealth for one so obviously elderly. In the dim moonlight filtering through the barred window, Eleanor made out the silhouette of a woman in a nun's habit, her wizened face partially concealed by her veil. Sister Agnes, from the convent beyond the village, a healer known for her knowledge of herbs and her kindness to the poor. Eleanor had encountered her many times while gathering medicinal plants for her mother. "Sister Agnes?" she whispered, confusion evident in her voice. "What are you—" "Hush, child," the nun interrupted, her voice barely audible. She glanced nervously toward the door. "There isn't much time. The night watchman will return to his post soon." From beneath her robes, she produced a small iron key, holding it out to Eleanor. "Take this. It's the key to the back gate of the chapel cemetery. You'll find supplies hidden behind the third tombstone in the eastern row. Food, a cloak, a small knife." Eleanor stared at the key in disbelief, not daring to reach for it. "But why? Why would you help me?" The old woman's eyes, roomy with age but sharp with intelligence, fixed on Eleanor's face. "I know what you found in the forest this morning, child. The orphan boy, Thomas. He came to me, told me everything before they sent out the search parties." She pressed the key into Eleanor's palm, closing her fingers around it. "The truth must not be buried, daughter. Go before it's too late." 1,000 questions tumbled through Eleanor's mind, but one pushed its way to the forefront. My mother, she needs me. I can't just leave her. Sister Agnes's face softened with compassion. I've arranged for her care. 2 of our younger sisters will attend to her needs. She will not suffer in your absence. The nun reached into her robe once more and extracted a small vial containing an amber liquid. A candle for your path. The truth must have light to grow. As Eleanor took the vial, her fingers brushed against the old woman's hand. Paper-thin skin over bird-like bones, yet there was surprising strength in her grip. But how did you get the key to my cell? Who else knows you're helping me? Sister Agnes smiled enigmatically. The night watchman enjoys his ale, perhaps more than he should. As for who knows, she glanced toward the door again. There are still those loyal to the true king, child. Not all have been seduced by Lord Reynard's promises of power and wealth. But they hide in the shadows, waiting, watching. She stepped back toward the door. Go now. Follow the stream path through the fields. It will lead you to the forest edge away from the search parties. With those words, she slipped out as silently as she had entered, leaving Eleanor standing in the center of the cell, key clutched in one hand, vial in the other. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. To flee would confirm her guilt in the eyes of the village, would make her a fugitive. But to stay meant certain death once Voss or the royal guards returned to question her more thoroughly. The memory of the king's face, caked with soil yet dignified even in his suffering, decided her. With trembling hands, Eleanor lifted the latch and pushed the heavy door open just enough to peer out. The village square lay deserted, bathed in moonlight. The guard's post at the corner stood empty. Sister Agnes had timed her visit perfectly. Eleanor slipped outside, keeping to the deepest shadows as she made her way toward the small stone chapel at the village edge. The night air bit through her thin dress, but fear kept her warm as she moved with the stealth of a hunted animal. Every sound, a dog barking in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the creak of a shutter, sent her heart racing anew. Discovery now would mean the gallows. The cemetery gate yielded to the key with a reluctant groan that seemed deafening in the still night. Eleanor held her breath, counting slowly to 100 before proceeding. The graveyard was an eerie place by moonlight, stone markers casting long shadows across the uneven ground. She counted the tombstones in the eastern row, her fingers tracing the weathered inscriptions until she found the third. Behind it, as promised, lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The supplies were modest but precious. A dark woolen cloak, a small knife with a bone handle, a loaf of bread, dried meat, a water skin, and, most surprisingly, a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Eleanor hesitated before taking the money. She had never stolen in her life, and even now, with her very survival at stake, it felt wrong. "It's not stealing if it's freely given," came a whisper from behind her. Eleanor whirled, the knife instantly in her hand, only to find herself facing the orphan boy from the forest. Thomas stood a few paces away, his thin face solemn in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, though relief flooded through her at the sight of a familiar face. "It's dangerous." The boy shrugged with the nonchalance of youth. "Everywhere's dangerous for me. At least this way, I'm doing something important." His eyes, too old for his young face, met hers steadily. "He's safe." "The king. I found a place in the old charcoal burner's hut, just like you said. Hidden him under the floorboards where they store the winter provisions." A weight lifted from Eleanor's chest. At least that part of their desperate plan had succeeded. "The search parties went right past it," Thomas said with a hint of pride. "They're searching the North Ridge now, far from where we are, but they'll be back. They're determined." He glanced toward the village. "You need to hurry. The watchmen will discover you're gone when they change guard at dawn." Eleanor nodded, quickly donning the cloak and securing the bundle of provisions. "Lead the way." "And Thomas." She hesitated, then added softly, "Thank you." The boy merely turned and began walking toward the stream path that wound behind the chapel, away from the village and into the open fields beyond. Eleanor followed, the vial Sister Agnes had given her clutched tightly in her hand. Only now did she wonder about the nun's cryptic words. "A candle for your path?" The small container held no candle, only the amber liquid. They moved swiftly across the moonlit fields, keeping to the shadow of hedgerows where possible. The stream, swollen with recent rains, gurgled beside them, masking the sound of their footsteps. Tomas moved with the confidence of one who had spent his life avoiding notice, guiding her along paths that seemed invisible until they were upon them. The forest loomed ahead, a dark wall against the star-strewn sky. As they approached its edge, Eleanor felt both dread and relief. The woods that had once been her sanctuary now held danger at every turn, yet they also concealed the one person who might restore order to the kingdom. "We should light the way," Tomas whispered as they reached the tree line, where darkness became nearly absolute. "I have flint." Eleanor remembered the vial. Understanding dawned as she uncorked it and caught the distinctive smell of lamp oil. "Not a candle," she murmured, "but the means to make light." She tore a strip from the hem of her dress, wound it around a stick, and soaked it with the oil. Thomas struck his flint, and soon a small torch illuminated their path. The forest at night was a different realm entirely. Familiar paths transformed into mysterious corridors, ordinary sounds magnified into ominous warnings. Every shadow seemed to harbor a royal guard, every rustle a potential ambush. They moved cautiously, Eleanor leading now as they ventured deeper into the woods, toward the abandoned charcoal burner's hut. As they crested a small rise, the sight before them made Eleanor's blood run cold. In a clearing ahead, illuminated by the silver light of the moon, lay a gleaming object half buried in mud. A golden crown, its jewels catching the light like drops of blood on the forest floor. "The king's crown," Thomas breathed, his young voice cracking with awe. Eleanor approached it slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. The crown was bent, one of its jewels missing, the gold smeared with something dark that could only be dried blood. Had the king lost it during their escape? Or had it been deliberately placed here, a lure in a hunter's trap? Her questions were answered by the sudden, unmistakable sound of swords being drawn from scabbards, followed by the glow of torches as figures emerged from the surrounding trees, encircling them completely. "Well, well," came a familiar voice as Gerard Voss stepped into the clearing. What an unexpected surprise. The escaped prisoner and a street urchin, found in the forbidden forest with the king's own crown. He smiled coldly. How very incriminating. Dawn broke over the kingdom, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, but Eleanor saw none of it. She moved through the shadowy back streets of the capital city, her head covered with a ragged hood, eyes downcast to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. 3 days had passed since her escape from the village lockup, 3 days of desperate flight, hiding in ditches by day and traveling by night. The boy Thomas had disappeared during the confrontation in the forest, vanished into the underbrush like a woodland sprite while Voss and his men were distracted by Eleanor's sudden dash in the opposite direction. She prayed the child had found safety. The city was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. Its stone walls rose imposingly around her, its streets teeming with more people than she had seen in her entire life. Market sellers hawked their wares with raucous cries, nobility rode past in gleaming carriages, and beggars huddled in doorways, their gaunt faces a reminder of how thin the line between survival and destitution truly was. Under different circumstances, she might have been awestruck by the grand cathedral spires or the royal palace visible on the distant hill. Now she registered them only as potential dangers, places where she might be recognized, captured, killed. The weight of her predicament pressed down on her with each step. Posters bearing her likeness had appeared overnight throughout the kingdom, crude sketches that nonetheless captured her distinctive eyes and the small scar on her chin. "Wanted," they proclaimed in bold letters. Eleanor Mills of Oakvale, traitor, conspirator, witch. The accusations grew more outlandish with each telling. In the tavern, where she had hidden briefly the previous night, she'd overheard patrons whispering that she had poisoned the king, that she practiced dark magic, that she could transform into a raven and fly between castle walls. The reward for her capture had grown from a few gold pieces to enough to buy a small estate. 50 gold crowns for the witch's head. a merchant declared loudly in the marketplace as Eleanor slipped past, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lord Regent Reynard himself has promised it. Imagine that. Enough coin to live like a lord for a year, just for catching one peasant girl. His companion laughed, a rough sound like stones grinding together. If I had that kind of fortune, I'd buy that new shipment of Eastland silks from your shop and still have enough left to drink myself blind for a month. You'd be better off investing in property, the merchant replied sagely. With the coronation of Prince Thomas approaching, land values near the palace will soar. Of course, everyone knows the boy is merely a figurehead. Lord Reynard will be the true power for many years to come. Eleanor paused, pretending to examine a display of apples while straining to hear more. The merchant lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent her from catching his words. They say the child hasn't spoken since his father's death. Just stares at walls, refuses food unless forced. Some of the palace servants whisper that he saw something about the king's death that wasn't natural. Careful, his companion warned, glancing around nervously. Such talk could cost more than your business these days. The city is crawling with Reynard's spies. The merchant nodded soberly, and they moved on, leaving Eleanor with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The prince, a child of only 8 years, was suffering while traitors ruled in his name. And the king himself, if he still lived, was alone and wounded, hidden in a decrepit hut that the search parties would eventually discover. Time was running out. She continued through the winding streets, making her way toward the river district, where Sister Agnes had told her she might find help. The buildings grew shabbier here, the streets narrower and fouled with refuse. The smell of the river, a pungent mixture of fish, sewage, and rotting vegetation, permeated everything. Eleanor pulled her hood closer, trying to block out the stench as she counted the alleyways, looking for the third turn past the cooper's workshop as the nun had instructed. The alley was little more than a crack between buildings, so narrow her shoulders nearly touched both walls. At its end stood a weathered door painted a faded blue, its surface peeling to reveal at least 3 previous colors beneath. Eleanor hesitated, then knocked softly in the pattern Sister Agnes had taught her. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Silence followed, stretching so long that Eleanor began to fear she had misunderstood the instructions or been led into a trap. Just as she prepared to flee, the door cracked open, revealing a single suspicious eye. "What do you seek?" came a whispered voice, neither male nor female in its huskiness. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Shelter from the storm," she replied, using the phrase Sister Agnes had made her memorize. The door opened wider, just enough to allow her to slip inside. The interior was dim, illuminated only by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across a room crowded with barrels and crates. The person who had admitted her was a small, wiry individual whose gender remained ambiguous. Cropped hair, plain clothes, features that could belong to either a boyish woman or a feminine man. "You're the girl from the posters," they stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Eleanor tensed, ready to bolt, but the stranger merely sighed and gestured for her to follow deeper into the building. They navigated a maze of stacked merchandise, eventually reaching a trapdoor hidden beneath a threadbare rug. The stranger lifted it, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. "Down there," they instructed. "Be quick about it. Patrols have increased since yesterday." Heart in her throat, Eleanor descended the ladder, finding herself in a low-ceilinged cellar lit by several guttering candles. The space was surprisingly large, extending beyond the building above. A dozen faces turned toward her as her feet touched the earthen floor, men and women of various ages, all bearing the watchful, haunted expression of those who lived in constant danger. An elderly man with a scholar's ink-stained fingers rose from his seat at a rough wooden table. "So," he said quietly, "you are the famous Eleanor Mills, the woman who found our king buried alive, who has become the most hunted person in the realm." His eyes, sharp despite his advanced years, studied her with undisguised curiosity. "You are younger than I expected." "And you are?" Eleanor asked, still poised for flight if necessary. "My name would mean nothing to you," he replied. "But in this room, I am called Keeper. We all use such names here. It's safer." He gestured to the others. Welcome to what remains of those loyal to the true king. Eleanor glanced around, taking in the sparse furnishings, the maps pinned to the walls, the weapons stacked carefully in one corner. This was no mere hiding place. It was a center of resistance. Hope flickered within her for the first time in days. The king, she said urgently. He's alive, hidden in the old charcoal burner's hut in Oakvale Forest. But he's wounded, and the search parties grow closer every day. We know, interrupted a woman seated near the maps. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back severely from a face marked by a long scar across one cheek. The boy found us yesterday, Thomas. He's been our eyes and ears in Oakvale for months. Relief flooded through Eleanor. Tomas is alive. He's safe. The woman nodded. As safe as any of us. He led a small group of our people to move the king last night. By now, they should have reached the caves in the western hills, a more secure location than a hut any hunter might stumble upon. Then why am I here? Eleanor asked, confusion replacing her relief. If the king is safe with your people, what use am I to you? The keeper exchanged glances with the scarred woman before answering. Because, Eleanor Mills, you have become something we could never have engineered ourselves, a symbol. The common folk whisper your name in taverns and markets. They wonder how a simple blacksmith's daughter dared to defy Lord Reynard. Some call you witch, others call you hero. He smiled thinly. Symbols have power in troubled times. Eleanor shook her head, bewildered. I'm no symbol. I'm just a girl who found a man buried alive and tried to help him. That man was the king, the scarred woman stated flatly. And now half the kingdom searches for you, while the other half secretly cheers your escape. Like it or not, your fate has become entwined with the fate of the realm itself. Before Eleanor could respond, hurried footsteps descended the ladder. The androgynous figure who had admitted her earlier practically fell into the cellar, face pale with alarm. Royal guards, they gasped. A full patrol moving door to door. Someone informed on us. They'll be here within minutes. The cellar erupted into controlled chaos. Maps were torn down, weapons distributed, secret exits revealed behind false walls. The keeper grasped Eleanor's arm, his strength surprising for one so aged. You must go, he urged, guiding her toward a narrow tunnel at the far end of the cellar. This passage leads to the river. A boat waits there. It will take you downstream to where the king is hidden. You must reach him before Reynard's men do. But what about all of you? Eleanor protested, even as she was propelled toward the tunnel. The keeper's eyes softened momentarily. We have played this game longer than you, child. Some will escape, some will not. That is the price of loyalty in these dark days. He pressed something into her hand, a small dagger with an intricately carved handle. This bears the royal seal. Show it to our people at the caves so they know we sent you. Above them, the sound of wood splintering echoed down the ladder shaft, the front door being broken down. There was no more time for words. With a final push from the keeper, Eleanor plunged into the tunnel, darkness swallowing her as shouts and the clash of steel erupted behind. The western hills rose like slumbering giants against the horizon, their slopes carpeted with ancient pines that swayed in the evening breeze. Eleanor's legs trembled with exhaustion as she climbed the steep path, each step a testament to her determination. 3 days had passed since her narrow escape through the underground tunnel. 3 days of hiding in the cramped hold of a river barge, subsisting on stale bread and rainwater collected in cupped hands. The boatman, a taciturn man with a face weathered by sun and wind, had spoken barely 10 words to her during the entire journey. He had deposited her at a desolate landing at dawn, pointing wordlessly toward a barely visible trail before pushing his craft back into the current. Now, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, Eleanor found herself utterly alone once more. The dagger the keeper had given her was tucked securely in her belt, its weight a constant reminder of both her purpose and the danger that pursued her. Her once sturdy boots had begun to separate at the seams, and her dress was so filthy and torn that it barely resembled clothing anymore. Yet none of these discomforts mattered. Somewhere in these hills, hidden in caves known only to a select few, lay the rightful king, wounded, vulnerable, and possibly the only hope for restoring order to a kingdom unraveling under Reynard's treacherous rule. As Eleanor rounded a bend in the path, a small figure emerged from behind a boulder, causing her to reach instinctively for the dagger. Relief flooded through her as she recognized the thin face and watchful eyes of Thomas. "You made it," he said simply, his voice betraying just a hint of surprise. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Eleanor admitted, her throat dry from the long climb. The boatman said little, but what he did say suggested Renard's men have sealed off most roads out of the capital. They're searching every village between here and Oakvale. Thomas nodded grimly. "They've put a price on your head that would make a lord envious. I overheard merchants saying it's up to 75 gold crowns now, enough to buy a manor house and lands." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You've become quite valuable for a blacksmith's daughter." The reminder of her former life, her forge, her cottage, her ailing mother, sent a pang through Eleanor's heart. It seemed a lifetime ago, though barely a week had passed. "Is the king safe?" she asked, pushing aside her homesickness. The boy's expression grew solemn once more. "For now. This way." He turned and began to lead her off the main path, following what appeared to be little more than a game trail winding through dense underbrush. "Watch your step. The entrance is well hidden for a reason." They moved in silence for nearly an hour, climbing ever higher into the hills. Darkness had fallen completely by the time Thomas stopped before what looked like a solid rock face partially concealed by a curtain of ivy. He pushed the vines aside, revealing a narrow fissure barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. "Mind your head," he warned, disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor followed, squeezing through the tight opening. The passage beyond was pitch black, forcing her to place one hand against the cold stone wall while the other reached out before her. She could hear Thomas moving ahead, his footsteps sure despite the darkness. After what felt like an eternity of blind stumbling, a faint glow appeared ahead, firelight flickering against stone walls. The passage widened suddenly into a cavern the size of a small chapel. Torches mounted in iron brackets cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls adorned with ancient faded paintings, hunting scenes and strange symbols that spoke of times long before the kingdom existed. A small fire burned in a stone circle at the center, its smoke rising toward a natural chimney in the ceiling. Around it sat half a dozen people, men and women of varying ages, all bearing weapons and the vigilant expressions of those accustomed to danger. They turned as one when Eleanor emerged from the passage, hands instinctively moving to sword hilts and knife handles. A tall woman with a single silver braid falling down her back stepped forward, her weathered face impassive. "So this is the girl who found our king," she said, her accent marking her as from the northern provinces. Her eyes, sharp as a falcon's, studied Eleanor with undisguised skepticism. "She doesn't look like much." Eleanor straightened her spine despite her exhaustion. "I have a message from the keeper," she stated, withdrawing the ornate dagger from her belt and presenting it hilt first. "And I've come to help however I can." The woman took the dagger, examining the royal seal on its pommel before nodding almost imperceptibly. "I am Mara," she said, returning the weapon. "Captain of what remains of the King's Guard, those few who weren't bought or intimidated by Reynard." She gestured toward the others around the fire. "We are all that stands between the rightful king and those who would finish what they started in the forest." "How is he?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Mara's stern expression softened slightly. "See for yourself." She led Eleanor toward a smaller chamber branching off from the main cavern. The king lay on a pallet of furs and blankets, his face pale in the soft glow of a single oil lamp. Clean bandages wrapped his torso and right leg, but the dark stains seeping through spoke of wounds still far from healed. His breathing was shallow, his brow furrowed with pain even in sleep. Next to him sat an elderly man with a physician's satchel open at his feet, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "His Majesty has developed a fever," the physician explained without preamble, not looking up from his work. "The wounds themselves are clean, but the days spent in the damp forest before proper treatment have taken their toll. He drifts in and out of consciousness." Eleanor knelt beside the pallet, her chest tight with emotion. This broken man bore little resemblance to the regal figure whose procession she had glimpsed once in Oakvale years ago. Yet even in his weakened state, there remained something undeniably noble in the line of his jaw, the set of his features. As if sensing her presence, the king's eyes fluttered open, clear blue despite the fever, startlingly alert. "The girl from the forest," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You survived." "As did you, Your Majesty," Eleanor replied softly. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "Thanks to your courage." His gaze shifted to Mara, who had followed Eleanor into the chamber. "Captain, has there been word from the city? From my son?" Mara's face remained carefully blank. "Not since yesterday, sire. Our last messenger reported that the prince remains under heavy guard in his chambers. They call it protection, but it's imprisonment in all but name." The king closed his eyes briefly, pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds etching deeper lines into his face. "And Reynard?" "Proceeds with his plans," Mara replied grimly. "He has announced a coronation date for Prince Thomas, 3 days hence on the full moon." Of course, everyone knows the boy will be king in name only. Reynard has already begun filling the council with his supporters. 3 days, the king murmured. So little time. His eyes opened again, fixing on Eleanor with unexpected intensity. "Tell me, girl who saved a king, why did you do it? You could have walked away, pretended you saw nothing. It would have been safer for you." The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. She thought for a moment before answering. "Because it was right," she said simply. "I couldn't leave someone to die, king or commoner." The king studied her face as if searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Integrity," he said softly, "rarer than gold in these times." He attempted to sit up, grimacing with the effort. The physician made a sound of protest, but the king waved him away. "I've rested enough. Time grows short, and we must act." "You're still weak, Your Majesty," the physician objected. "The fever will have to be endured," the king finished firmly. He turned to Mara. "Gather everyone. We must make plans." Within minutes, the entire group had assembled in the main cavern. Besides Mara and the physician, there were 4 others: a grizzled archer with a badly healed broken nose, twin brothers who served as scouts, and a soft-spoken woman who had once been the king's food taster. Thomas hovered at the edge of the circle, technically not part of the group, but tolerated due to his proven usefulness. The king, supported by Mara and the physician, had been helped to a rough-hewn chair near the fire. Though obviously in pain, he spoke with the clear authority of one born to command. "In 3 days, Reynard will attempt to place my son on the throne as his puppet," he began, without preamble. "Once that ceremony is complete, his position becomes nearly unassailable. The nobility, already cowed or bribed into compliance, will fall in line. Those who resist will find themselves without allies." His gaze swept the small assembly. "We must reach the capital before then." "With respect, Your Majesty," the archer spoke up, his voice gravelly from years of shouting commands on battlefields. "That's a suicide mission. Reynard has tripled the city guard. Every gate is watched, every road patrolled. And forgive my bluntness, but you can barely walk." "Nevertheless, it must be done," the king replied. "I will not hide in caves while usurpers steal my son's birthright." His eyes found Eleanor's across the fire. "Besides, we have something Reynard does not expect, a symbol that has captured the imagination of the common folk." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who felt her cheeks flush with uncomfortable heat. "Your Majesty, I'm no symbol," she protested. "I'm just a peasant girl who defied the most powerful man in the kingdom," the king finished for her. "A commoner who chose truth over safety, right over expedience. Stories of your defiance have spread throughout the realm, growing with each telling. Reynard's attempts to demonize you have only fueled the people's fascination." A knowing smile crossed his face. "Sometimes the fate of kingdoms turns not on armies, but on simple acts of courage that inspire others to find their own." The weight of expectation settled over Eleanor like a physical burden. She looked around at the faces watching her, some doubtful, others calculating, a few openly hopeful. The reality of what the king was suggesting slowly dawned on her. You want me to help you reach the capital, she said slowly. To use my reputation somehow. The king nodded. The people will rally to a story they believe in, especially in dark times. His expression grew grave. But I will not command this of you. You've already risked more than any sovereign has right to ask of a subject. The choice must be yours. Silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision pressing down upon her shoulders, a weight far heavier than the simple choice it appeared to be. To agree meant placing herself at the center of a dangerous gambit that could easily end with her head on a spike. To refuse meant abandoning the king, abandoning any hope of restoring rightful rule. The faces of those she had left behind flashed through her mind. Her ailing mother, the villagers of Oakvale, Sister Agnes with her cryptic wisdom. What would become of them under Reynard's rule? What would become of the kingdom itself? The great hall of the royal castle hummed with tension, voices of nobility and common folk alike rising in a discordant chorus that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the assembled crowd. Lords in their finest silks and velvets, merchants in well-cut woolens, village representatives in their humble but clean attire. All had come to bear witness to what was being called the trial of the century, the judgment of Eleanor Mills, the peasant girl accused of treason, witchcraft, and conspiracy against the crown. Eleanor stood in the center of the hall, her wrists bound with iron shackles that bit into her skin. The fine dress they had forced her to wear, a mockery of courtly fashion in harsh black, felt alien against her skin after weeks in tattered rags. Her hair had been roughly washed and combed, her face scrubbed clean, all to present her as something more than the wild fugitive who had been dragged through the city gates at dawn, captured in a raid on a farmhouse just leagues from the capital. The crowd's eyes bored into her from all sides, some curious, some hateful, some pitying. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to show fear despite the hammering of her heart. Before her sat the tribunal, 3 judges selected by Lord Reynard himself. At their center, a corpulent man with jeweled rings on every finger and cold, calculating eyes that never seemed to blink. On his right, a severe woman whose pinched face suggested she had never known joy. On his left, a younger man with a scholar's ink-stained fingers who avoided looking directly at the accused. Behind them, elevated on a smaller version of the royal throne, sat Prince Thomas, a small, pale child with his father's blue eyes, now dulled with grief and fear. The boy hadn't spoken a word during the proceedings, merely stared vacantly at a point somewhere above the crowd. Lord Reynard stood to the side, impeccably dressed in midnight blue velvet trimmed with silver. His thin lips were curved in what might have appeared to be a benevolent smile, but the cold triumph in his eyes revealed his true feelings. This was his moment of victory, the capture of the kingdom's most wanted fugitive, the public disgrace of the woman who had somehow become a symbol of resistance to his rule. Eleanor Mills of Oakvale, intoned the center judge, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed hall. You stand accused of crimes most heinous against the crown and kingdom. How do you plead? Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but Reynard stepped forward smoothly. If I may, Lord Justice, he interrupted with practiced deference. Before the accused responds, it seems only proper that the full extent of her crimes be enumerated for all to hear. His gaze swept the assembled crowd. The people deserve to know the depths of treachery that threatened their beloved prince's succession. The center judge nodded, yielding the floor with a wave of his ringed hand. Reynard turned to face the crowd, his posture that of a reluctant bearer of difficult truths. Good people of the realm, he began, his voice pitched to carry without seeming to shout. What you see before you is not merely a peasant girl who lost her way. She is the center of a conspiracy that sought to undermine the very foundations of our kingdom during its time of greatest vulnerability. He paced slowly, commanding attention with every measured step. Following our beloved king's tragic passing, may he rest in eternal peace. This woman began spreading malicious falsehoods. She claimed that the king still lived, that his death had been falsified. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reynard raised a hand for silence, which fell immediately. But her lies went further still. She sought to gather dissidents to foment rebellion against the rightful succession of Prince Thomas. He gestured toward the silent child on the throne. She aimed to destabilize the realm at its moment of greatest vulnerability, for purposes we can only speculate upon. His voice lowered dramatically. Some witnesses have attested to seeing her practicing forbidden arts in the forest, communing with dark forces to enhance her influence over the weak-minded. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more hostile. Eleanor remained still, her face impassive despite the outrageous accusations. The shackles felt heavier with each passing moment, the weight of the kingdom's hatred pressing down upon her shoulders. "I call upon our first witness," Reynard continued. "Master Gerard Voss, royal merchant and loyal servant of the crown." Voss stepped forward from among the courtiers, his elegant attire marking him as a man of considerable wealth. He bowed deeply to the judges and the silent prince before turning to face the assembly. "I encountered the accused in the village lockup of Oakvale," he began smoothly. "Having heard rumors of her strange behavior, I sought to understand whether she posed a genuine threat. What I found was disturbing indeed. A young woman possessed of unusual charisma, speaking of visions and conspiracies, claiming that the king had been buried alive and that she alone had saved him." He shook his head in apparent sadness. "When I suggested she seek help for these delusions, she grew hostile. Later that night, she escaped custody and fled into the forest where royal guards discovered evidence of occult rituals. Lies. All lies." Eleanor bit her tongue until she tasted blood, forcing herself to remain silent as witness after witness came forward. A village woman claimed to have seen her gathering poisonous herbs. A royal guard testified that she had attacked him with unnatural strength when he discovered her in the forest. A scholar suggested that her apparent ability to evade capture for so long indicated supernatural assistance. With each false testimony, the mood in the hall grew darker. Eyes that had held mere curiosity now gleamed with fear and hatred. Faces that might have shown sympathy hardened into masks of judgment. This was no trial, Eleanor realized with sinking heart. It was theater, carefully orchestrated to ensure her condemnation not just by the court, but by the people themselves. When the parade of witnesses finally ended, Renard approached her directly, standing closer than was necessary, his voice pitched low so that only she could hear. "Did you truly believe you could win?" he murmured, his breath smelling of expensive wine and mint. "A blacksmith's daughter against the might of the kingdom?" A cold smile flickered across his features. "Your little resistance is broken. The so-called loyalists in the capital have been routed from their hiding places. Those who weren't executed immediately now rot in dungeons, awaiting their turn on the scaffold." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though each word struck like a physical blow. Had they all been captured? The keeper, Mara, the physician, all those who had risked everything for their rightful king. "And as for your king," Reynard continued, correctly reading the question in her eyes, "we've yet to find him, it's true, but it hardly matters now. Even if by some miracle he still lives, what can one broken man do against an entire kingdom that believes him dead?" He stepped back, raising his voice once more to address the court. "I believe we have heard enough, Lord Justice. The evidence is overwhelming." The center judge nodded solemnly. "Indeed, Eleanor Mills, you have heard the charges against you. What say you in your defense?" At last, after hours of silence, Eleanor was permitted to speak. She raised her head, looking not at the judges but directly at the small figure of Prince Thomas. The boy met her gaze for the first time, something flickering in his dull eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simply curiosity. "I am no witch," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her dry throat. "I am no conspirator, no traitor. I am a simple blacksmith's daughter who found a man buried alive in the forest. A man I later learned was your father, my prince." She spoke directly to the child, ignoring the outraged murmurs her words provoked. "He lives still, though those who stand beside your throne would have you believe otherwise." Reynard's face darkened with rage. "Silence her," he commanded. "She spews treasonous lies even now." "Is truth treason then?" Eleanor countered, raising her voice as guards moved toward her. Is it treason to say that Lord Reynard ordered his king buried alive? That he proclaimed a false death while the rightful monarch still drew breath? The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles gasped in outrage, commoners shouted questions, guards surrounded Eleanor with drawn swords. The center judge pounded his gavel furiously, demanding order that would not come. Through it all, Eleanor kept her eyes on Prince Thomas. The boy had leaned forward in his seat, truly focused for the first time. Their gazes locked across the tumultuous hall, a silent connection forming amid the storm of voices. "Enough!" Reynard roared, his carefully cultivated poise crumbling. "I will not have the prince subjected to these vile fabrications." He gestured sharply to the guards. "Remove the prisoner. The verdict is clear without further disruption." The guards seized Eleanor roughly by the arms, but before they could drag her away, a new sound cut through the cacophony, the deep, resonant blast of a horn, followed by another and another, the ancient signal that heralded the arrival of the king himself. The great doors of the hall swung open with a thunderous crash. Every head turned, every voice fell silent as a figure appeared in the doorway. Tall, despite leaning heavily on an ornate staff, royal blue cloak billowing around shoulders still bearing the evidence of recent wounds, face pale but unmistakably regal. King Edmund, thought dead and buried, stood before his astonished subjects. Behind him came his loyal few, Mara with her hand on her sword hilt, the physician carrying his satchel of medicines, the archer with his bow at the ready, and Thomas darting between them like a shadow. "It seems," said the king, his voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent hall, "that rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Time itself seemed to freeze as King Edmund stood framed in the doorway of the great hall. Sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the golden threads in his royal blue cloak, creating an almost ethereal glow around his figure. The silence that had fallen was absolute, a silence so profound that the king's labored breathing could be heard across the vast chamber. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire assembly had been transformed into a tableau of shock and disbelief. Then, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, the stillness shattered. A noblewoman near the front fainted dead away, collapsing into the arms of her startled companion. A ragged gasp arose from the crowd, followed by confused murmurs that quickly swelled to a roar of exclamations, questions, and cries of astonishment. "The king lives!" "It cannot be. We were told." A miracle from heaven itself. Prince Thomas, who had sat like a listless doll throughout the proceedings, suddenly came alive. He bolted from his small throne, evading the grasp of his attendants with the nimbleness of youth, and ran headlong toward his father. "Father." The boy's voice, unused for so long, cracked with emotion as he flung himself into the king's arms. Edmund staggered slightly under the impact but remained standing, clutching his son to his chest with fierce protectiveness, his eyes closing briefly in a moment of pure relief. Lord Reynard's face had drained of all color, leaving him ashen as a corpse. His hands trembled visibly as he took an involuntary step backward. This is impossible," he stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. "Some trickery, some impostor." The king gently disentangled himself from his son's embrace, keeping one arm around the boy's shoulders as he advanced into the hall. Each step was clearly painful, but he moved with grim determination, his eyes never leaving Reynard's face. "No trickery, my old friend," Edmund said, the term of endearment laced with ice, "though I understand why you might wish it were so." He gestured toward the assembled nobility, many of whom had sunk to their knees in homage. "Shall I recount for our good lords and ladies exactly how I came to be buried alive in the royal forest? Shall I describe the faces of the men who beat me, bound me, and covered me with earth while I still drew breath? Shall I reveal whose orders they followed?" Reynard's composure crumbled completely. His eyes darted around the hall like those of a cornered animal, seeking escape where there was none. The guards who had been ready to drag Eleanor away now stood frozen in confusion, uncertain where their loyalties should lie in this unprecedented situation. "Guards!" Reynard finally managed to shout. "This is an impostor! Seize him immediately!" Not a single guard moved. Their eyes shifted from Reynard to the king, then to Captain Mara. who had drawn her sword and now stood at her sovereign's side. The captain's face was a study in barely contained fury as she surveyed the men she had once commanded, men who had apparently chosen self-preservation over their sacred oaths. "Your Majesty," she said formally, never taking her eyes off the hesitant guards. "Your orders?" The king's voice rang out clear and strong, belying his weakened physical state. "Captain Mara, arrest Lord Reynard for high treason against the crown and release Eleanor Mills from her bonds immediately." The tableau unfroze in an instant. Two of the king's loyal followers moved swiftly to surround Reynard, who no longer made any pretense of dignity. He backed away, wild-eyed, his hand moving to the ornamental dagger at his belt. "You cannot do this," he hissed. "The council has already acknowledged me as regent. The documents are signed, the arrangements made. The kingdom is mine." "The kingdom," replied the king with dangerous softness, "was never yours to take, Reynard." He turned his gaze to the assembly, who watched the confrontation with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Look well upon ambition unchecked by honor, my lords and ladies. Look upon the face of a man who would bury his king alive, imprison his prince, and condemn an innocent girl to death, all to satisfy his lust for power." A moan of shock rippled through the crowd. Even those nobles who had allied themselves with Reynard now edged away from him, unwilling to be associated with such heinous crimes. As Mara and the archer closed in on Reynard, the merchant Voss suddenly pushed through the crowd, making for a side door. Thomas, quick as a shadow, darted after him, tackling the larger man around the knees. Guards who had finally decided where their loyalties lay moved to secure both Voss and Reynard. In the commotion, Eleanor stood forgotten, her shackled hands before her, watching the scene unfold with a sense of unreality. After days of desperate planning, after a perilous journey that had nearly cost them all their lives, after the heart-stopping moment when they'd learned of her capture and hasty trial, it was over. The truth had emerged, shocking and undeniable. The king approached her now, his son still at his side. Up close, Eleanor could see the toll the journey had taken on him. New lines etched into his face by pain, the slight tremor in his hands that he couldn't quite control, the careful way he distributed his weight to avoid aggravating his wounds. Yet there was nothing weak about the authority in his bearing or the clarity in his eyes as he addressed her. "Eleanor Mills," he said, his voice gentler than before but still carrying to every corner of the hushed hall. "Kneel." Confused, Eleanor awkwardly lowered herself to her knees, the chains between her wrists clanking against the stone floor. The king drew a ceremonial sword from a scabbard held by Mara. "Your chains," he commanded, and a guard hastened forward with keys to remove the shackles. As they fell away, the king placed the flat of his blade on her right shoulder, then her left. "For courage beyond measure in the face of certain death," he intoned, the formal cadence of his words lending them weight and significance. "For loyalty to crown and kingdom when all others faltered. For truth spoken regardless of consequence. I, Edmund, fourth of his name, do recognize before all assembled the nobility of spirit that transcends birth or station." He sheathed the sword. "Rise, Lady Eleanor of Oakvale, royal protector and guardian of the truth." A collective gasp swept through the hall. What the king had done was unprecedented, elevating a common blacksmith's daughter to nobility with a field accolade, a practice usually reserved for knights on battlefields. Eleanor rose unsteadily, her legs weak, not from her ordeal, but from the shock of this unexpected honor. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice faltering. I only did what anyone would." "But that is precisely the point, Lady Eleanor," the king interrupted, a genuine smile warming his haggard features. "You did what anyone should have done, but what so few actually would." He turned to address the assembly once more, his voice ringing with renewed strength. "In times of darkness, it is not always the high-born or the powerful who show the way back to light. Sometimes, it is the most humble among us who remind us of our better natures, of the courage and integrity that should define us all." The crowd stirred, murmurs of agreement mingling with sounds of awe. Many bowed their heads in shame, recognizing how quickly they had turned on one of their own, how easily they had accepted lies when truth seemed inconvenient or dangerous. Prince Thomas, still clinging to his father's side, looked up at Eleanor with wide, solemn eyes. "You saved my father," he said simply, his voice small but clear. "Thank you." Those 3 words, spoken with a child's directness, broke something inside Eleanor. Tears welled in her eyes, tears she had held back through captivity, through fear, through exhaustion and danger. She knelt once more, this time bringing herself to the prince's eye level. "Your father saved himself, Your Highness, with his courage and determination," she replied softly. "I was merely fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time." The king placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression grave once more. "The truth can be buried," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. "But it cannot remain entombed forever. Like a seed in the darkness, it pushes upward, seeking light, breaking through whatever soil or stone has been heaped upon it." His gaze swept across the assembly, lingering on those who had allied themselves with Reynard. "Let this be a lesson to all who would twist power to their own ends, who would sacrifice honor for ambition, who would choose expedience over justice. Truth may be delayed, but it cannot be denied." As if to punctuate his words, the cathedral bells began to toll across the city, bells that had been silenced during the period of false mourning, now ringing out the joyous news that their king lived. The sound flooded through the open windows of the great hall, mingling with the growing cheers from the streets as word spread through the capital. Eleanor stood in the midst of it all, still scarcely able to believe the turn of events. From a simple blacksmith's daughter to the most hunted woman in the kingdom to a newly minted lady of the court, it seemed impossible, like something from a minstrel's fanciful tale. Yet the shackle marks on her wrists were real, as was the king standing before her, as were the cheers now rising from the gathered nobles and commoners alike. In that moment, as the kingdom itself seemed to exhale a collective breath of relief, Eleanor found herself thinking not of honors or accolades but of home, of her mother's cottage with its herb garden and smoking forge, of the simple life she had led before fate intervened. What she had told the king remained true. She had done only what she believed right, what anyone with a conscience should have done. That such actions had become remarkable spoke volumes about the world they lived in, about how precious and fragile truth could be. As if reading her thoughts, the king leaned close. "You wish to return home," he said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. "If it pleases your majesty," Eleanor replied, surprised by his perception. "My mother has been brought to the palace," the king finished for her. "Captain Mara arranged it before we left the hills. She is being cared for by my personal physicians." A smile touched his lips. "But I understand the desire for the familiar, for the life that was interrupted by these events. When the time is right, you shall have your wish, though I hope you will consider visiting the court from time to time. My son and I owe you a debt that can never truly be repaid." Eleanor bowed her head, overwhelmed by gratitude and relief. "The truth resurrected," she murmured, echoing his earlier words. "Just as you said, Your Majesty. The truth resurrected," he agreed solemnly. And with it, hope for a kingdom that had nearly forgotten its own heart. Eleanor's journey reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from ordinary people. When faced with that moment of terrible choice, to walk away or to act, to remain silent or to speak truth regardless of the consequences, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to defy a kingdom for what you knew was right, even as the price on your head grew with each passing day? The truth, as King Edmund said, can be buried but never truly entombed. Like a seed in darkness, it pushes upward, breaking through whatever soil or stone has been heaped upon it. In our own lives, we face smaller versions of Eleanor's choice every day. Moments where standing for truth might cost us dearly, where silence would be the safer path. Yet it is in these moments that our character is revealed, not in grand palaces or on battlefields, but in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. If you found yourself moved by this tale of courage against overwhelming odds, of truth resurrected from the very soil that was meant to bury it forever, please support our channel. Share this story with others who might find their own courage in Eleanor's journey. Subscribe to hear more tales that stir the heart and challenge the soul. For in stories, as in life, We find reflections of our better selves, reminders of the light that can never truly be extinguished, no matter how dark the world becomes.